Hello, everybody.
Hello.
So, Sato-san, I know you, of course, and who else is on the call?
Um, I'm not sure, but from my side, just me.
Okay, I see Akash. Is that how you pronounce it? Maybe they were left over from the prior meeting. Okay. Akash says he's having trouble with his microphone. And hi, who else is on? Karthik, is that how you say it? Okay, so we'll get started. We have a small group here, but we can go through the contributor meeting for Hyperledger Fabric today. Mostly what I wanted to talk about was the V3 release. Does anybody else have topics for today?
Okay, Dev. Hi, Dev. Good morning.
Hello, how do you pronounce your name?
Karthikeyan.
Kathy Kane? Okay.
Yes.
All right, does anybody else have agenda topics besides discussing the version 3 release?
Okay.
All right, if you don't have topics, you can go on mute. All right. So I'll talk about what we've been doing with version 3. We've been trying to get ready for this version 3 release. We made good progress, and just yesterday we did a release candidate, which is kind of our final step that we utilize for testing. So we've got the binaries and images out there now in GitHub and in Docker Hub. So we're using those for some final testing. I'm trying to get the Fabric samples to work with that. It seems pretty good, except for I'm having some issues. I think it's around the Ubuntu update. So that's one of the last things we did before the release, trying to update the binaries and the images to build with Ubuntu 22.04. And I'm just working through the last issues to get the samples working with that. While I'm down here, I'll talk about some of the other recent updates. Before we did the release candidate, we also updated the protocol buffers. So there's new bindings using the API v2 or the new protocol buffers bindings and API. This is wire compatible with the old protocol buffer bindings. And I did confirm that by doing some tests with a mixed environment of Fabric 2.5 and Fabric 3.0, and that seems to be working as expected. So that's good news. We're good that we were able to get that in. And the last thing I wanted to mention was the Java chain code and the Node chain code support. So the support is still there, but we're not releasing 3.0 images for Node chain code and Java chain code, but you can continue to utilize the 2.5 images with those. And then in fact, that's how the peer sample configuration is set up to utilize those 2.5 images now. So those were some of the recent updates that we're doing final testing on with the release candidate. I'll also have links here pointing to the recent updates in the upgrade documentation. So if you're interested in understanding the upgrade process, check this out, especially the considerations for getting to version 3. And then I'm highlighting a blog post that talks about the Smart BFT consensus, which is the new major item in version 3, allowing Byzantine fault tolerant behavior of the ordering nodes. So you can have a fully decentralized ordering service now across different organizations. That's the key item in version 3. So I expect we'll wrap up this release this week. If you're just joining us, I mentioned at the beginning that we have a release candidate out there. So you're welcome to give that a try. That's out in GitHub and in Docker Hub at this point. So those were all the announcements I had. I'll open it up for other discussion or questions.
Just a comment. I think that it's great that this is finally out as a release candidate. It's a big deal, I think. And I like the architecture very much. The only question I would, and the other thing that I really like is the level of compatibility support that I think you've provided, which is actually really important to get people to look at this and say, hey, is this a candidate to move to at some point? Because of the high level of compatibility between different versions on a, in a sense, multi-blockchain network kind of a deal is a big deal, I think. That's good. The one thing I would ask is, I think, and just to confirm, with Smart BFT, that's just a consensus protocol, and I still can use Raft, right?
That's right. So the two options in version 3 are Raft and Smart BFT. So if you're updating from 2.5, you're probably using Raft already, and you can continue using that with no changes, or you have the option to migrate over to Smart BFT, and there's instructions in the upgrade documentation about how you would do that. You'd basically first have to update your ordering nodes to version 3 and then enable a channel capability,
Right.
to be able to switch over to Smart BFT.
Yeah, excellent.
So yes,
So
yeah.
the one thing I think about when I think of going forward, in what I call fabric architecture, different than the, I'll call it conventional DLT concepts, is the idea of addressing, I'll call it more use cases than we currently address with, in a sense, I'll call it continued increase in the flexibility of the architecture. So for instance, you could say, okay, going forward, no need to use BFT if you're not interested. If your situation is such that, RAF works, go with that. So we have flexibility in the architecture. And what I'd like to see going forward architecturally is that we keep opening the flexibility, which would, from an architecture perspective, which would allow addressing other use cases that the architecture doesn't address well today. That's all. I mean, it's an architecture strategy, I think, that would be valuable especially when I look at other DLTs that lack some of that flexibility inherently. It makes them a lot less useful, I'll say, for a set of use cases that are higher transaction volume and don't have the same consensus requirements, for sure.
Right, yeah, so that's definitely one of the objectives of Hyperledger Fabric, is to keep that flexibility. Did you have any specific features or use cases you
here's the
wanted to
deal.
highlight?
So the weirdest thing is, obviously, we've got this new thing now. We're not Hyperledger, we're now Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust. And so the challenge of it is, what I see, and I really like Fabric as the better starting point. Again, I go back to this, we call it Jim's crazy concept, that we need architectural flexibility. So when I look at a project like Firefly, it's built around the concept of interfaces for every service. So whatever the service is, we have an interface that defines what the service has to do. And then you can say, hey, here's a default implementer of that service. But then the reverse of it is you can add your own implementers as needed to fit different use cases. But that, what I call service interface architecture, allows you to redefine in a sense, the framework, the platform, as needed to fit almost any use case. And I think Fabric clearly has found a home in what I call certain industries. But I think the opportunity to do better from an architecture perspective for more use cases is the concept of opening it up to say, there's a set of capabilities that I'll call it Fabric provides that enable trust in I'll call it a complex environment, including transactions, all kinds of other stuff. If you look at trust from the top down, you'd say, oh, trust is much broader than a blockchain by far. There's many, many other components to trust. But if you open up the architecture, a little bit more of those use cases can be supported by, I'll call it, a more flexible DLT model. So as an example, I came up with a label, which I call VSLT, which is Virtual Smart Ledger Technology, which is not as limited conceptually as DLT. It has some more capability mentally, in a sense that you could address some other capabilities beyond the simple stuff. So Fabric to me is the better building block today for adding that architectural flexibility down the road. Anyway, that's just, I'll call it a political statement, I guess.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with the objective and the high level points. If you have specifics around like what else we can do to be more flexible or specific use cases to go after, definitely
Yeah, so the two things
let us know about that.
actually well, three things, obviously. Consensus thing, I think we just keep adding consensus methods as needed. That's all in the future. And there's a service interface for what a consensus does. And that's different. There's some different roles, I'll say, that I can see in ledger technology. And biggest thing probably is when I attack it is segregating the concept of what a transaction lifecycle looks like. So right now we have this notion of, consensus, and then you, in a sense, I'll call it, push the transaction to the network. Not all applications have the same need for, I'll call it, the same architecture for that transaction lifecycle for sure. So I built what I call data lakes that are different than, I'll call it a DLT network. And in a data lake, we have different what I call criticalities and functional requirements for different types of services. And in that flexible architecture, we say, oh, okay, so this is the right life cycle for this particular service. And here's a different service that has a different life cycle. So we don't have a single life cycle. We have multiple life cycles we can implement based on, I'll call it application criticality and functional requirements for synchronization, those kind of things. So the biggest thing probably is the separation of the concept of commit versus finalization of a transaction, which we don't do. Do you know what I mean? So we physically do it because we're replicating over this. We have this state machine replication model across a network. And you say, and so picture this, picture 100 nodes in a network. Picture that the transaction I'm talking about doesn't apply to all 100 nodes. Honestly, it applies to a portion of the 100 nodes that need to know, say 10 nodes out of the 100. And what you're saying is, okay, this request comes in, we do the validation, the consensus is there, we validate it and say, okay, that transaction is valid for its purpose and its intent. And now we want to go ahead and apply it to the network. And when we do that, at that point, we commit the transaction to say, we have the transaction, no matter what happens, no matter how the network fails, we will wind up replicating properly and finalizing this transaction across the portion of the network that needs to know about this transaction. It sounds idiotic, but it's a very, very different concept, obviously based on data lakes than what I'll call it DLT does today, which has this sort of rigid concept. Everybody has to be in sync on all segments of what I call a ledger, which could potentially have multiple segments. That's all. Yeah, and there is even the concept of how you've already got it in Fabric, but the concept of being able to add dynamically, new nodes, we had what was the anchor peers concept and all that kind of stuff. But the idea that in a way you can say discover additional, I'll call it potential candidates to onboard to the network, define in a sense the services they need, in a sense the interest they might have in the network. In a sense, Fabric has that architecture, multi-channel. Maybe the new member only has an interest in channel A, not B, C, D kind of a thing. There's all kinds of flexibility that you've already built into the base architecture for this DLT platform that does not exist in other architectures. Just to give you an idea, the channel thing is huge. Why? Because if I look at financial transactions and regulation, I can honestly say, you have an easy time implementing something like transactions for central bank digital currency, CBDC, because in a financial transaction, the first thing that happens is we need to determine, not from a ledger perspective, but from a business perspective, is the transaction legal? And how do you do that? on a separate channel, you can say, okay, this is where the regulator sits. So the regulator actually looks at a transaction proposal before, in a sense, the physical blockchain does. Once that happens, you then pass it to the regular, what I call network, which is a different channel of all the financial institutions that go through and process the transaction. At the end of that, the regulator channel, and again, has to be notified that now that transaction that was agreed as legal is now on the network properly. And as a result, from an audit perspective, the regulator channel needs to know about that. So your channel architecture by default fits certain use cases quite well that other platforms don't have that kind of segregation. And they rely more on security mechanisms to say, you can see this, I can't see that. But the cleanliness, I'll say, of the multi-channel architecture for certain use cases is lost. And people who, I'll say, whatever, Ethereum, look at any of the rest of them, they don't have that concept. So you're trying to force and retrofit, I'll call it additional security models to segregate in by role some of those things that fit segregation easily in your architecture better.
Yep. Yep.
So
Okay.
there you go. That's my commercial.
All right. Thanks, Jim.
Sorry. Anyway.
No, that was all good. Does anybody else have comments or questions?
Yes, Dave, actually, we have one question. So, we are trying to do one upgrade. So from, like, say we are having one system where we have used the CryptoGen to generate the cryptos for all the organizations and the orderers also. Now what we are trying to do is we are trying to replace all the cryptos which generated using the cryptos, and we are trying to generate the new certificates using the Fabric CS server, and we are trying to replace them one by one. Now we are able to replace further all the organization, all the nodes is successfully upgraded, but when we are trying to do it for the orderer, we are facing a issue that TLS is already configured in the Genesis block. So TLS is already like enrolled in the Genesis block. So that's whenever we are trying to start with the new TLS, it is failing, saying that the TLS is not there in the system, not there in the test chain ID. So is there any way to upgrade the Genesis block for the orderer TLS, or we need to like, is there any procedure to upgrade this?
So you wouldn't update the Genesis block, but there is this concept of channel configuration. The Genesis block is basically the initial state for the channel configuration. You can do channel configuration updates. So in the case you're talking about, you would have to add the CA root cert of the organization to the channel. And then you would have
TLS.
to add the new order node TLS certificate to that channel as well. So you have to do those two things, and then you can update the ordering service node itself.
So first we need to upgrade the config channel config, is it?
Yes, the channel configuration. So you do that with a special channel configuration transaction.
So channel configuration, we need to update the test chain ID here. Channel, when we main channel configuration upgrade,
You need to add a second CA to the organization so that you're telling the channel that you're supporting now the old CA, which was your CryptoGen one, and you're supporting the new Fabric CA one. So that's kind of to make sure all the organizations that are participants understand when they see a certificate from this new CA, like if they should trust that or not. And then you'll have to do the same thing for the ordering node TLS certificate itself. Put that on there so the other ordering nodes will be able to recognize it.
So order also we need to mention both the old and new TLS, old and new CA things, certificates.
For the org level, you need the CA cert for both the old and the new. For the ordering node TLS certificate itself, you only have one. So you would just update the old one, replace it with the new one. And you would have to do that one at a time on a rolling basis across all your ordering nodes. So that, for example, if you have consensus with 5 ordering nodes, you would do this with one first, and you would basically have consensus with 4 out of 5. Update the channel configuration to look for the new TLS certificate, and then update that ordering node it's its own TLS certificate. And then when you start that back up, you should get a consensus with 5 out of 5 again. And then
Okay.
after that, you would do the same thing with the other 4, one at a time.
Okay. Then after that, since we have configured, upgraded the channel config with both the CAs, whether we need to remove the older CA cryptos again, or is it fine to keep both the CAs also in the channel config?
You can keep them both, or eventually you can retire the old one. It's up to you. It doesn't really matter.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, so the kind of the high level flow is mentioned in the certificate management guide in the documentation, but I know it's a little bit high level, and it's, you know, it's not really prescriptive in terms of step-by-step instructions.
Okay. Then we will try this. Otherwise, we will reach you through Discord.
Yeah, okay.
Thanks. Thank you.
All right, anybody else have questions or comments about the release or anything else? Okay, I guess that's it. We'll close the call for now then, and we'll see everybody next time.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah,
Thank
okay.
you, guys.
Thanks. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.